The poet was exultant, his mind sharpened by the cold, clear air and the fabulous vista that lay before him. He was returning from Connaught over the high mountain pass to his home in the kingdom of Munster after a long absence, and he had with him a poem for the king, which he knew was a good one. It would be a winner. In those days, being a poet to a king was a well-respected and well-rewarded position. Poets had the important task of recording and celebrating great events and significant feelings. So he was able to travel in style with a retinue of men on a splendid white steed with its mane dyed purple and its tail dyed purple to match the colours of his splendid cloak. Few people made that journey at that time of year when there was still a risk of snow and when the warm summer scents had not yet begun to take the edge off the icy winds. So the poet was surprised as he turned a corner to see a drover with a single cow making his way slowly down the path. He saw at a glance that this was a man in his middle years whose skin had been weathered by the elements and whose cloak was well used. The poet hailed the drover and asked what brought him over the pass when frost still lay on the ground and the winds were still bitter. Pestilence had killed his cattle, and he'd had to work in the northern lands for many months to get money to buy a cow to restart his herd. As soon as he had enough, he'd started the journey back to Munster because he could not wait to return to his beloved homeland. The poet could see how much the drover loved Munster and confided that he shared this passion. Indeed, the poem that he was bringing with him concerned the stirrings of his heart for Munster. Would the drover like to hear the poem? The drover's face lit up. He was overcome with emotion at the thought that he might have this honour, and the poet dismounted and signalled to his men to make a place for them to sit whilst he unfolded the poem. The leader of his retinue pulled the poet aside and reminded him he should not do this. The value of a poem was in its first reading. That was what was paid, and it was the king who would pay. The poet gently dismissed the man's concerns and with a serene smile went ahead and read his poem. When he had finished, the drover was at first silent. To speak too soon would seem insincere. To take too long would seem rude. After the perfect interval, he looked at the poet and spoke his insight. How wonderful it is to be able to take the thoughts of your heart and turn them in a rhythm that will last. For a man's wealth is transient and does not last beyond the grave, but this poem will be with us for eternity. Then, having paid his compliment, the drover made the more customary payment and offered the poet what he had, his cow and his cloak. And the poet accepted graciously, and they went on their ways. The drover returning to Munster, where the pestilence was over, and he hoped to be able to earn enough to buy another cow, and the poet to the king's court. The king's feast was colourful and raucous, with rich foods and strong drink. As the main course ended, the king got to his feet, gestured towards the poet, and expressed his eagerness and anticipation for the first reading of this new poem about Munster. The poet's mouth got this metallic taste of fear in it as he controlled his nerves and broke the news that this would not be the first recital. The king became flushed, his face darkened with anger, and he demanded an explanation. The poet told of the cattleman, his words about the poem, and his generosity in payment. At this, the king's attitude changed. He unclasped his coat, lined as it was with ermine, and flung it into the centre of the room, saying, "This drover is a good man and true, and I give him my cloak and 6 of my finest cattle." Then the most powerful nobleman sat to the king's right, followed suit, threw down his cloak, and offered 6 cattle. Then the next nobleman did the same, and the next, and the next. Now I know you're wondering what happened to all those cloaks and all that cattle. Well, it's said that the drover kept the king's cloak for himself and gave away all the other cloaks to the poor. With all those cattle, he became the richest drover in Munster. Yet he remained a humble man. He never forgot the insight that he'd had that day high up in the mountains where the air is cool and rare. An insight that means you too are seeing things differently now. That wealth is only of significance in this life. And the most precious thing is to be able to take the thoughts of your heart and record them in a rhythm that will last. Merry Christmas.